type of mentality that we've been characterized by for 8 years,
right.
And that probably affected how we felt we could enter the global arena versus the now, let's be a little more sensitive to what's happening internationally. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Without question, regardless of our own views of the politics of it, there seems to be a growing sense of, okay, maybe we can give the Americans another shot, because largely the current administration is well loved by many places around the world. The thing that I think is interesting, though, is we're already seeing those numbers start to fall back. So initially, a year ago, right on the cusp of the election, there was this huge enthusiasm, but now that we're still engaged in Afghanistan and not entirely sure what we're doing there's lots of people going, okay, maybe this isn't all that different. Maybe there's just a different face to it. The thing that's interesting about your question is India becomes an interesting case study here. There is no U.S. administration, at least in recent history, that's been more pro-India in terms of the policies they've developed than the Bush administration. Yet if you just talk to the basic Indian public, they love Clinton way more than Bush. And, if you look at some of the policies that were formed by the Clinton administration, it could appear like, wow, they didn't do much to help India at all, and the Bush administration did. But there's this whole subtle way of how people encounter things that it didn't matter that the policies had actually been changed. There was still this perception of kind of the Wild West, our way is best kind of mentality. Maybe one more thing on that point. One time I'm strolling around the streets of Delhi, and this guy comes up to me and he says, "You're an American, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, how could you tell?" He's like, "I can always tell. It's just the speed you're walking and the confidence." And he said, "Yeah, so what do you think about the current president?" Bush was president at the time. And we talked about it a bit, and he said, "Yeah, whenever he comes, he doesn't even shake anybody's hands." And I was saying, well, in a post-9/11 era, that's an interesting. He said, "Yeah, but Clinton came, he used to hug people and get out there." So again, regardless of how we might view about the political figures, there's these huge perceptions that are informed about our president and their administration that then impacts how we go about doing business there.
Like it or not, in practicality, the armed forces of the United States theoretically deal with more mixed cultures than the business community. I mean, they're our biggest emissaries globally. Now, you hear a lot of reports about how they've sort of had to adapt to the different standards, just like we did in Vietnam, understanding how our quote-unquote enemy at that time thought and operated. You're hearing more reports from the field back and seeing more interviews with soldiers who've had to interact with the population. There may or may not be action or activity going on to engage them at that time. So their time in the field and in these various countries is really far extended from what it may have been in the past, plus the level of interaction we've had to have with these other armies. So has the Department of Defense embraced some of the stuff you're talking about in terms of cultural CQ because it's such an important part of our mission at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's easy to find a lot of horror stories and mistakes that are done by the armed forces, in part because they're so large and they're so visible. But I would say, to their credit, there are some key people in positions of leadership who are saying, hey, we've got to understand the Islamic mindset and how that impacts what's going on in the place. So, and specifically are tapping into cultural intelligence and saying, as you well noted, it's not just understanding the local culture of which they're going to be part, but all the cultures of these other armies that we're working with. So there are some colleagues of mine who have worked very specifically with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in talking about how does this cultural intelligence actually become a skill set that they can teach everyone from the private level up to a senior officer.